name is Chuck Treece. I play for my own band, McRad, Bad Brains. Work with Michael Franti from Disposable Heroes, Urge Overkill. I'm involved with this guy, Mike Pinto. He's a reggae guy around. Also, Stress. He had a band called Suburban Hoods, and we do a bunch of remixes for like Gym Class Heroes and a bunch of things. There's more bands. I'm trying to blank right now. But yeah, I've done a bunch of touring and playing with jamming with Stone and from Pearl Jam, and getting a chance to play drums for this impromptu or last minute Green River tribute, which is like Stone's first band with Mark from Mudhoney and all those guys. So I was on tour with Urge, and during this Pearl Jam set, they decided they were going to do these two Green River songs. So I got a chance to play on one of them. Wow. They recorded it live, and the Pearl Jam released it on a double 45. They have like a fan club. They release certain items too. It was one of that. So yeah, there's a lot. I mean, there's more people that I've jammed with and played with. Okay, let me see. Going back to, it was probably like 11th grade. I would just come up to South Street to Zipperheads was on South Street, and then there was like another little punk rock shop that was kind of like below, like kind of near Penn's Landing, but on the kind of on the close to the city side of right before you cross over to Delaware. It was like a little shop that I used to go to buy Sex Pistols t-shirts and stuff like that. And so it seemed like the scene, from what I got from South Street at that time, because that's where most of the venues were. Dobbs, there's a place called Ripley's, Grendel's Lair. That was a club that was there. And there's a couple other clubs that were around, but those were the mainstay. And also East Side Club, which was like where I saw like the Professionals play, which is Steve Jones's band. I mean, that's like the first things that were coming into Philly. We're going to the East Side Club, also the Love Club, which we played our first show with Minor Threat and stuff like that. So that's like McRad, Wide Eye, FOD, Autistic Behavior, all these different bands, around that were in Philly, like 1982 to 84. We had Center City, South Street, also West Philadelphia, which was the CEC Center, where you did shows, and Government Issue played there, GBH played there, Necros played there. I mean, all these different, just Void. We opened McRad, we opened a show for Void there. So that was, it's. I don't know, we didn't really call it hardcore at that time. It was just kind of like more or less like the punk scene. The hardcore movement, started a little bit after that. I can't remember the first band that really kind of went that way, but I think Why Die was the first like kind of hardcore, like rocker, band that had that kind of, they could stay up with all the different bands, like, because the bands from Boston and New York had a rougher sound, a bigger, rawer sound. See, more of the bands in Philly, like FOD, we were really influenced by like the Boston scene, like Gangrene and early Tang Records, bands that would just come more frenetic and stuff like that. And people wanted to play harder, louder music, but it would seem like there's a band called the Stickmen. Most of these bands that kind of created the punk and weirdo scene, art scene, which is kind of like coming out of the beatnik scene. Also out of the hippie scene. Like the Hot Club was the first place that they had to play, which were Pure Hell, and all those guys came out of that scene in Philadelphia. And the Hot Clubs, kind of spawned in the East Side Club. Bobby Startup was a huge DJ that would always be around playing shows, and Revival was in all of that. But it just seemed like it was more of an artsy scene that all of this aggression started to come out of. Because when I first moved to Philly in '82, it was like musicians were playing on the street everywhere. All the musicians knew each other. The only difference was like the independent scene was here, or the punk rock scene or whatever, and then we had MMR, which was like Tommy Conwell and the Hooters and all that stuff, and we didn't want anything to, kind of like do with that, because it didn't relate to what was actually going on in the city, which was like people writing, people being creative, The spark that got the ball rolling was Red Records. They had a good label, and they did a compilation record called Get Off Our Backs, and they just put all the bands that were doing shows in Philly, and we all had two songs apiece to kind of showcase ourselves. And then from that, that record, you know, Richard picked out like 4 or 5 bands, which was Rowan, Bunny Drums, McRad, and there was another release that he had on, you know, Red Records, and that was our first, you know, we had 10 hours to go into the studio. We went in 1983, and had the 10 hours to record it and mix it and put it out, and we had to actually put the records in the sleeves and everything together, you know, ourselves. I mean, so that was kind of like, for us, as far as what we would consider hardcore punk rock, that was our first moment. And other bands were doing things and putting out their own 7-inches and stuff like that, but for us being on a label that had, like, you know, that could sell 300 records and get us out there amongst people, that was it. But there were so many different, I mean, the Bad Brains that played early in Philly, and, you know, SOA and Black Flag. I mean, all the bands came through Philadelphia. You know, all the shows have different memories with tons of fights and where, you know, cops, you know, freaking out. First leading band to pay respects to the Philadelphia scene would probably be the Stickmen. They were like the biggest, like kind of like punk funk movement, kind of like how the Minutemen are to like LA, and that. Well, the Stickmen were the first original, you know, just kind of like out there, you know, group. I mean, there was a group called the A's who kind of did it, but it was more like new wave rock. But to me, the thing that happened was going to shows and seeing the Stickmen. And this was the guy, Timmy Tanzania, who was a reggae artist who did reggae and rock, and was also from the punk scene and went to punk shows. You know, those two bands to me were the first ones that stuck out. Then after that, there was Bunny Drums, Mr. Maida, you know, a couple of the bands. These are the bands that we just kind of looked up to, you know, that were there. And then Autistic Behavior was the first band that was like kind of like, that was aggressive enough and from all the different scenes, but you could tell that the music was getting harder, it was getting faster. You know, they actually took time to write songs and parts. And so Autistic Behavior was kind of like our lead-in band that we all kind of wanted to be. Them, Why Die, you know. McRad started in late 82, myself, Zeke Zagar, and he's from like South Street, and his father's Isaiah Zagar. That's all the broken glass painting thing. So we kind of started this artsy skate environment. We used to skate Cherry Hill Skate Park, and like when I was like 14, 15, and Zeke was real young, his dad would take him there. And all the guys, skaters from Philly, the artists, musicians, would skate Cherry Hill. Cherry Hill closed. I moved to Philly. I meet up with them, and in that crowd of people, you know, was myself. You know, I skated with Zeke at Cherry Hill. He was there. He's a bass player. And Zeke also was the original bass player of FOD. When I first started going to shows in Philly, I used to go to see Zeke play, it was like, I don't know, 12, 13, playing in FOD at the time. It was like a 3-piece band, you know, and I liked them because they sounded a lot like Gangrene, you know. And so also in that circle was Ethan, which is our lead singer, and he just hung out with us and went to shows, and Ethan had a car, so we would all hang with him. And then Tristan worked at Zipperhead, or Skins actually, on South Street, and that was like an old punk rock, you know, it was like Zipperhead was here, and then Skins was a couple doors down, and that was kind of like the place where the scenesters hung out. HR booked us in DC, we opened up for Human Rights, and then we would go and play other places. I think we played a show in Connecticut, and we were about to play a show in Trenton before the original band broke up. We kind of got ourselves around. We played CBGB's. We played A7 in New York, which is like a club where Harley started out with the Stimulators, and Harley from Cro-Mags and all stuff like that. But when I first met Harley, he was just, you know, a teenager in New York. He was Stimulators and, you know, the Beastie Boys that were at that time still running around in the punk scene, you know. So it was kind of, you know, pretty crazy, you know, to be involved with. It was just, you know, the underground scene was like, you know, pretty vibrant. We still had like great clubs to go to play. It was the first, the original lineup broke up in the summer of '84, and then I moved to San Francisco. Zeke did a show, and then I with the band, and it kind of did, you know, what it needed to do. And then I came back from San Francisco after just, you know, riding out there and hanging out with my friends and skating. And I decided to get back together with Zeke in like, it was like 85-ish, you know what I mean? To just do a show, and then I shut it down for like about 5-6 months to kind of recreate the sound, because I wanted to go for more of a metal sound, because it was in the Slayer and Metallica and stuff like that. So I started writing for about a year straight, and then we had our second record come out, which is Absence of Sanity in '86 through B-Rare Records, and that was a San Francisco-based company connected with Thrasher magazine, and I wrote for Thunder Trucks, and Brian Ware, who owned Thunder Trucks, also was a record guy, just was into collecting records, so he signed us, Stevie Caballero's band, Mofo's band, Drunk Engines, and it was like another band. How I ended up with the Bad Brains was, first connection was HR booking us, to open up for him in '84, so I kind of, knew him, and we would go to the shows when they would play in Trenton and hang out with him a little bit. And so it got to a point where I was playing guitar for Underdog right before they released Vanishing Point, which is, I think, I can't remember, like '87 around there, '88. Opening up for Murphy's Law and a bunch of other bands. And Doc and Daryl and Mackie were at the show. They came up to me and were like, hey, we're thinking about, trying out different people for lead singers, because they had this guy Taj that they were working with, and they felt like, well, before we go solid in on him, let's try some other people. So they auditioned me for vocals, and it was right when they were recording the Quickness record. Mackie plays drums on that record, not Earl. Earl's on the front cover, but Mackie's doing the whole record. And so I wrote to 4 or 5 songs, auditioned, but it didn't work out. HR, was back in the band, they did the record. They tour on that record. I get called back in to rehearse because they want to build up the band again because HR had gone in separate ways from the band. And so I started playing drums, and we just started, learning songs, like just taking time for me to learn how to play what Mackie played, what Earl played, and making it my own. And then we found Israel, who was on the Rise EP, or the LP, and Mackie got back in the band because they felt that he was a stronger drummer, which, I understand. It was a great decision. Mackie's a great drummer. He knows Doc and Daryl. He's been playing with those guys since he's been like 14 or something in New York, So they did the record. They toured for a year. Mackie left. They called me. I went on tour with them for 6 months. We did a tour of Japan, a tour of Europe, and a tour of the States. And I basically had to learn 25 songs in 5 days. Within any show, there's always like these power hungry, people, which we all are, because, I'm power hungry because I want to see the band and see what they're playing and see why, a Les Paul sounds different than a Strat through this amp or through that, and each band had different combinations, and, when you get a pleasure to see like DOA or the Bad Brains or anybody, any of the Midwest bands or, Necros, you get to see a different treat. But there's also people that go to shows and be like, well, I just had a crappy day, and there's people that I like, and there's people that I don't like. The people that I don't like, if I get mashed up with them with the pit, then it's kind of, something's going to happen. So there'd be, violence, which we got used to. But the one thing that I remember first being like not completely scared of the show, because I lived in West Philadelphia, so it was kind of like gnarly there. It was just a different gnarly. We were watching a bunch of bands from Boston, and they had a thing where they would just show up with their crew in the bands, and then they would just control the floor. And anybody that would get in the pit, they would just like, beat them down, And the thing about it, we loved all the, not every Boston band did that. Like when, Jerry's Kids came through with Chris from Gang Green playing guitar, it was a different vibe. But certain bands just carried a different, like SSD Control was like the band that carried more of like, we're going to control the club while we're here. And we weren't used to that, you know what I mean? And that was something that was like the most bummed out. Or when Minor Threat was playing a show over in Camden, and it was in a rough neighborhood. Me and Zeke and a bunch of the guys that skated in Philly, we actually took the subway over there. The guy was like, don't do that, because you guys are going to get chased. And we literally got chased by dudes, like 12 dudes throwing like bricks, and they held our one friend at knife point, just like, so we had to go back and get him. And, what I mean? We thought we would have to fight a bunch of dudes because we're in Camden, and this guy from New Jersey, he's like from North Brunswick, he's never seen it. He's never had to deal with being chased down the block by one. I mean, city kids have to deal with that, you know what I mean? So as we're getting to the venue, we hear that while Ian McKay from Minor Threat was going to get something in the van, a person in the car literally swerved and tried to either hit the van or hit him. And he was on, I guess, in or on it, or jumped on the van and fell off and smacked the back of his head. So if you look at the Camden, New Jersey Minor Threat show, I mean, he even says it, like he's got like like a yoke on the back of his head. I think he went straight to his head on the pavement. He still performed like a show, and the show even got violent because a local girl was in there on stage. She didn't want to move, and then they decided to move, and the girl's like either brother or friend was there, and then they started. It was just a night to where everybody was shook because you're in Camden, New Jersey, and it's 1983. You know what I mean? It's like a different time. They weren't even like half of Philadelphia that wasn't even built up. People that like go to like Silk City and stuff like that. That was considered like almost like a gangland like at certain points. And it's just amazing that we had the energy to even go to Camden. But Minor Threat, it's like you kind of knew that when they were playing, you should go, even if you knew that it was going to risk, And there was other clubs that had more violence. Club Pizzazz had twice the violence. Trenton City Gardens had twice the violence, but for some reason, it wasn't as weird as being in Camden, because Camden's kind of just off in the middle. You just feel like you just kind of you're lost. It's like it just seems like those cities kind of, if you were to like analyze DC and New York and other places, and Boston, they kind of have more of an infrastructure of like being something that's a little bit newer. Philadelphia is like the only city that could say that we kind of basically started society with like with Ben Franklin and what all those guys did. The Declaration of Independence. I mean, that's like more of a punk rock statement than anything. Not too many cities can say that, like, a group of people just sat in a room and made something that was chaotic, real. And that's what, Philadelphia has always kind of been. So we don't get that tag of like, the whole DC sound and the whole whatever. Our sound was like, no, like, we're going to take from John Coltrane. We're going to take from all these different funk and rock artists, and we're going to put it into this scene. And then bands eventually got harder, but they got harder because it was more of a metal base. And Sabbath has always been big in Philadelphia. All the hard Blue Cheer, all those bands that were really aggressive, they were always appreciated in Philadelphia, which made the metal scene vibrant, in Philly. So I think that we have our own niche versus like, if you go to DC right now, you won't see one band that sounds like Ignite or Void, or there may be, but not as much as it used to be. And the same with New York, the early, New York sound, and then when it went into Antidote and, Agnostic Front and, Murphy's Law. I mean, those bands are still playing, but the original sound of those cities changed a lot, even with hip hop. Philadelphia's maintained its like, kind of like weirdness, which I think is better, because there's been a lot of great bands that are big now from that. And sound just as hard, and just, I guess they have a little bit more room to breathe. Yeah, Pagan Babies for one, Bad Luck for one, Anthrophobia, which is another band that was Frank Phobia. He always did a lot of shows, and he started doing shows at the Silo out in Reading and Heasters, and supports the scene a lot. So Frank has definitely had a huge influence. Wide Eye is another one. Seeds of Terror is an early band from New Jersey, huge influence. Actually, Small showed me how to do a frontside boneless before it was even invented. He actually invented the frontside boneless, this trick that became real big in skating. But we looked up at the Seeds of Terror because they were the first band that had two lead singers in the band, and people weren't even doing stuff like that, And so they were that autistic behavior was that. Stickmen were really important to me. Bunny Drums were important to me. Mr. Maida, She-Males, which is like our first kind of like raw rock. Electric Love Muffin is another good band. The Blunder Boys, which is a band that I don't know if anyone's talked to you about them, but they
never heard them yet.
Dave Roshan from FOD, his original band, when I used to hang with Ethan, because Ethan lives in Haverford, PA, and went to Havertown High. We all used to hang together in Ardmore, and it was me, Ethan, the guys from FOD, and also the dudes from Blunder Boys, and then Rich from Electric Love Muffin. He came out of that scene, too. And that's Blunder Boys to me were like kind of like the first sign of a band being close to like what Black Flag was, but a little different. And it's amazing that a lot of people don't know. I mean, Kremlin Corpse was another band, which Doug was, from Eastern New York right now, more of a reggae guy. He was involved with that. And there's a lot of bands. Philadelphia's great for that, because there's a lot of people here that support music and buy instruments, and that's, regardless of the scene. I don't know, because I feel kind of I get a little vague about what I feel music is, but you know what I mean, you have to invest in your product, you gotta invest in your tone. I mean, like, watching Minor Threat playing, these guys are like, you know, we came up with playing like a small PB band at 35 watt, 75 watt, whatever, crappy amps, and we see Minor Threat and they have Marshall half stacks and nice guitars, and we started realizing, like, regardless of the scene, you have to craft your tone, and it's amazing through all the different scenes. The Boston scene is more of a rock scene, because they come up with hearing Les Pauls all day long. The Midwest people do too, so it's just amazing that it all created punk rock to make it better. Like, because the Sex Pistols, to me, never mind the Bullocks, it's one of the best sounding records, period. Road to Ruin, Ramones, the Dickies, Rizzillos, all these different bands that have put out great raw rock records, even the early Kinks stuff, you know. But it's cool that they gave it a chance to grow past where they saw it, and even get dumbed down into just like almost like hate rock, you know, go beat yourself up, you know, in the pit, which is, that's cool too, you know what I mean? I'm glad that came into, you know, went into like Hatebreed and all those other bands that have like stemmed out of just taking all that aggression and making it more like watching Jamie craft his career. I remember seeing Hatebreed when they were still an underground band, but still having a good audience. Like Jamie's like a perfect example of someone that completely understands hardcore, understands reggae, understands all the different aspects about it, and then understands about being clear-headed and is not afraid to talk about gratitude and giving thanks and doing whatever. And that's all just you know, putting a good impression, because I never thought that Jamie would to be where it's not that he wasn't worth it, but you know what I mean, the fact that there's at one point where you could just go and just see him at a show, pay like $5-10 and just watch the band. Now it's like, it's a big deal that he's created this small spark, and he definitely went back and did his history before he moved on, because Hatebreed sounds like every part of what music is, as just a regular band that just used to play hardcore shows. Most of those bands could never break from that, per se. Maybe Dillinger Escape Plan, but not as on a wide scale accepted. You know, Jamie's accepted as a metal connoisseur, you know what I mean, which is amazing. You know, he has so much knowledge. What I spun off into after I got a record deal with Caroline, like '89, after I was playing guitar for Underdog on the Vanishing Point tour and on the record. And so I started, you know, recording that record and ended up working with Dennis Dragon, who's from the Surf Punks out in LA, you know, the premier kind of like band that like created a lot of stuff for skate bands in that era. Like they're like kind of right after the Beach Boys as far as like, you know, their impact on that. So I worked with Dennis because he was working with Stacy Peralta, and I worked with Stacy with Public Domain and Band This and Propaganda, doing music for those guys. And so we decided to be like, well, why don't you just put together a demo and we'll, you know, shop it. So I went into talking to Keith Wood at Caroline Records and said, hey, I want to do a record. And it was right before Smashing Pumpkins and it was like Gish came out. Like the pecking order that I was in was Springhouse, Robert Fripp, myself, and Smashing Pumpkins, and also Courtney, you know, Love's Band Hole was, you know, in all that signing. It was right when Nirvana was about to blow up before they got signed, you know, that crazy deal with Geffen. It was like $300,000 a record. No other local band was getting that much, and you know, it's just, yeah. So I mean, I started meeting all these different bands through Caroline Records because I was able to travel and go out to LA and hang with Zach. And so what I did is like I moved around in LA just to, you know, figure out which studio I was going to record in with Dennis. And then I started working with Ron St. Germain because Dennis and I went to one level and then made it take it to the next level because the record label wanted to. So I met a bunch of friends before on the Underdog tour that lived in Irvine, which was Zach from Rage Against the Machine, who was also an Inside Out. Rob from Hard Stance, which he ended up starting a band called Far Side. And Josh Stanton, who worked for Revelation Records, and was also the bass player on Far Side. And then Mark, Rob's brother, and all these different people, and actually Tim, the bass player of Rage, hung out with all of us. It's like the whole Irvine crew, the whole like kind of like anti-LA thing. And so through all of those guys, I started meeting different people in different bands, but it was because of just always being out there doing something different and running into all these different people. There's more people that I could mention, but it just seemed like when I had an agenda, there was always the right people around, you know what I mean? But hanging with the guys in Irvine, all those, like Rob and Zach and all those guys, that was priceless. Even Dan Mahoney, we started a project. You know, he's from Go For An Answer. His name was the lead singer from that. And we had a project called Voice Box. So we started, you know, when I moved out there, do some writing and stuff like that. So what Philadelphia, like, music means to me, period, like, from all of it, the entire aspect of it, it's a creative, there's a lot of history. I hope that, you know, all these different documentaries and films being made, at some point there could be a huge kind of like music library congress or film congress of where you can go get each story, you know, because it's like these films are like going to shows. Each one is completely different, and it's amazing now that before you make choices on bands, you can actually go back and do clear history versus us having to like feel like we were less than because we couldn't get accepted in history. You know what I mean? So that's the only thing. I'm happy that Philadelphia's like stood its ground